Well, Canada is a strange country in that it is large and largely unpopulated. But Canada is a place where everybody really wants to go. In fact, back at the time of Moses, you know that Moses had a speech impediment, right? That's why Aaron had to speak for him. And so God asked Moses, "Where do you want to go?" Now, because of his speech impediment, he wanted to say Canada, but it came out Canaan. And God thought he said Canaan, and that's why they all ended up there instead of Canada. However, Louis, get the name straight here, Louis the 14th was a fellow who decided that Canada would be a great place for settlers to move. And so he did a lot in trying to settle and take over the area of Canada. The Americans, I should say the English, had America down in the south here. The Spanish had the area south of what is now United States. The British also had up at Hudson's Bay. So the French wanted to get an area, and they chose the area around the St. Lawrence River. Well, they didn't just choose it, that's what was left for them. And they moved into that area. They also moved into that area because everybody wanted to find a fast route to China and India. They wanted to get there as best they could. And there was this big chunk of land blocking the area. And so this fellow here, LaSalle, he decided, well, he didn't just decide, but the king asked him to do a lot of exploring. And what he did first of all was he explored the St. Lawrence River up into the Great Lakes. And if anyone's been to Niagara Falls, he went up in that area as well. And he did a lot of exploring in that area. Then he went down the Great Lakes and into the northern Mississippi River and followed the Mississippi River down to the coast. So he was really the first Canadian to come to Mississippi. But there was no Mississippi at that time, and there wasn't even a Canada at that time. It was just New France. But he moved down into that area, went down in that area, explored that, and he claimed it for France. And so the name Louisiana, named after Louis the 14th. So Canada has a big influence in giving us the name we have for our territory and now the state of Louisiana. Well, let's go to our next slide here, and I think that's a picture of Louis. Yeah, there he is. It's a little elongated. It wasn't quite that fat, but I couldn't do it with my computer to get him to fit right in there. But you'll notice that Louis was a kind of a pompous fellow, and he was very proud of himself, and he believed that he could make Canada a great place and Louisiana a great place if he could get enough settlers to move there and to explore and use all the resources that were in those areas. Now, Canada was and still is a place where there's a lot of wilderness. The northern part of Canada, at least the northern part of what is now Quebec and Ontario, is a woodsy area around the Hudson's Bay and into the Canadian Shield. The Canadian Shield is an area where there is a lot of rock, very little vegetation grows up there, but great for growing furs because it's cold up there, as you know. And that's probably how most of you think of Canada. It's the place where the cold air comes in the middle of winter. Well, Louis encouraged a lot of people to come to settle in Canada. He was a fellow who at one time was a Calvinist. In other words, a fellow who believed in the teachings of John Calvin. However, when he got to the gates of Paris to claim Paris, all the people of Paris said, "We don't want a Calvinist. We want a Roman Catholic to be our king." So he made that famous statement, "Paris is worth a religion." And so he became Roman Catholic at that point. But he always had a tender spot for the Huguenots, that is the Calvinist French. And he encouraged a number of them to move to New France, that is what is now Canada, and later on also to the southern part of the United States, Louisiana Territory. Next slide, please. King Louis said to, or encouraged La Salle then, once La Salle had come down the Mississippi River, he encouraged him to find the mouth of the Mississippi River. But as you notice from this map, and this map, and this map, all the coast of United States from Florida to Louisiana looks the same. And so he couldn't really find where the mouth of the Mississippi River was. So he moves across here and he goes in different spots. And this is not it, this is not it, this is not it. Finally, he comes down to this area down in here, what is now in Texas, and he establishes a fort down there. Unfortunately, there was some bad weather. One of his ships got wrecked. His troops rebelled against him and murdered him. So he never got to get any claim to fame for finding this coastal area and finding actually the mouth of the Mississippi River. So if we go to the next slide then, that's the same slide, isn't it? Oh well, this is, as it says here in French, and my French has failed a little bit in the years since I've taken it and spoke it. D'Iberville in 1698 and 1699, he's going to follow the movements of La Salle as he tries to find his way through here. And as he does, he finds that he has the same problem. He was a fellow who came up this coast, and he says, this looks like a bay, and it could be the river. Well, first of all, he comes across here to an area, Pensacola, and the Spanish had settled there. So he tries to go into that port, and the Spanish won't let him in Pensacola. They do give him some water and some wood to take along, but that's all they would do for him. So he comes then over to Mobile, and he goes into that bay, and he says, well, this looks like a good spot. And he establishes a little fort there in Mobile. He comes a little far, he finds that's not the Mississippi though, so he comes a little further, and he finds that there is a place between Ocean Springs and Biloxi, and that looks like a big river. And so he establishes Fort Maurepas. How do you say it? Maurepas. There you go. Maurepas there. And you've probably all seen the old structures that were over there, or the park at least that's still in Ocean Springs. And he establishes a little fort there. He comes a little farther, and he says, wow, this looks like a nice bay. I'm going to name this after, because it was not Louis XIV this time, because it was St. Louis Day, he says, I'm going to name this the Bay of St. Louis. So we have another Canadian influence over in this area. Now, interestingly, as he came across this area, he brought with him about 900 people. Some of them were women and children, because they wanted to settle in this area. That was Louis' dream, to settle this area. And so he brought these people with him. About 600 of the 900 were actually Canadians. They had gone to France to help the king fight as the war of that he was fighting with the, I think it was the War of Spanish Succession at that time, but I may be mistaken in that. Anyway, he wants to settle all these areas, and D'Iberville comes all the way down and finally comes up into this area of the mouth of the Mississippi River, and he actually does find it. He and his brother, actually there were 8 children in the Des Moines family, and if you go to Montreal, you still find there's a museum there or a home called the Des Moines family home. And he and his brothers, all named sort of strangely because they don't have the same family name. In fact, they do have the same family name, but it's not where we would think it would be. If I said my name, it's Jim Codling, so my last name comes last, right? Well, that's not the way they named these guys. And if you go to the back there, you can pick up one of these little things that Eddie put together. Wasn't it you, Eddie, put that together?
Yes.
Quite a few years ago, and it's very good commentary on what had happened in those early days. But it's Pierre Lemoyne Sieur d'Iberville. But his brother is named Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne Sieur de Bienville. Okay, so we call him D'Iberville and Bienville. We're thinking that's their last name. It wasn't. That was just where they were from when they were named, okay? Well, anyway, after the Treaty of Ryswick in 1697, Louis XIV directed this minister of France, whose name, interestingly enough, Comte de Pontchartrain. Where have you heard of that before? Okay. To immediately commission D'Iberville to locate the mouth of the Mississippi River and establish a colony there to secure it from France. And he comes over to the United States here, what is now the United States, and they find a few of these different places along the coast. Finally, they come to an island where in 1699 called Ship Island. Well, of course, it was called in French, Isle aux Vaisseaux. On the 11th and 12th, they explored the island. They brought their cattle ashore, and they raised their flag for king and country. Now, as we think of this, or at least as I thought of this, they came over in big warships. Well, these were settler ships, so they had cattle and women and things to grow and to settle. That was their purpose. The unfortunate thing is they weren't really settlers who came over in that ship. They were more soldiers. Well, anyway, they leave from that island, Ship Island, and they go straight north, and they land in what would be probably halfway between Beauvoir and Edgewater over in Biloxi. Following morning, they go up and they explore some things on the shore, and they follow some native peoples. We used to call them Indians, but you can't call them Indians anymore, okay? So you know who they were, right? They follow footprints, and they come to a place where they catch up to these young men. The young men flee into the bush. An old man is left by himself there, and he's dying, and he dies the next day, so he can't give them any more information except that they find that somebody knows that there's a big river further to the west. His hunters go out hunting for meat, and they catch an old lady who was out in the bush there, and they give her a bunch of gifts to take back to her village. That's the first diplomatic exercise that the French or the Canadians had with the Americans back in those days. So they gave her a bunch of things. They meet together, and they find that there is this river over here. So they are interested in getting to that river, and so off they go again with the idea of finding this river. They, on February 27th, they set out to visit the Mississippi River with 48 men. They travel and they find the mouth of the Mississippi. They move up the Mississippi until they come to a place that has a large pole that separated two tribes, the Homas and the Bayagulas. That separated these two tribes. It's sort of like a totem pole. It was red in color, and so they called it Baton Rouge, okay, or Red Stick, if you want to call it that. And so again, we have the Canadian influence in the United States and what they had discovered and what they had found. On his return trip from that, d'Iberville discovers the proof of the fact that LaSalle had been there, in that LaSalle wrote a letter and he left it with one of the chiefs of the tribe. Now the chiefs were enterprising young men, and so he just didn't give him the letter. He made him barter for the letter. But he did find the proof that he had, that LaSalle had been there in that area, had come down the Mississippi, and this definitely was the Mississippi River. So he had proof of that. He divided into two parties. Bienville went into this area. This map is so strange here. Okay, he went into this area, and let's go to the next slide. Yeah. Here is this is probably LaSalle, claiming the territory for France. And Louis that's the Grand there. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, here's d'Iberville, and this is his history before he becomes a explorer. So I'm reverting a little bit. At 12, he becomes a cabin boy on his father's ship. After military experience in King William's War and the Avalon Peninsula Campaign in 1696, he is given the task of locating the mouth of the Mississippi by Pontchartrain, as we said. And so we have Fort Maurepas, 1700, he builds a second fort. 1701, builds the fort at Mobile. 1706, he dies with yellow fever in Havana. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, Bienville, where d'Iberville went and he went into these areas here, Pontchartrain and what is called Lake Catherine. Bienville came down the Mississippi and he went to the mouth of the Mississippi where probably we have New Orleans today. So he had already gone down there. Then when d'Iberville goes back to France, he leaves his brother, his younger brother, Bienville, to be the governor of Mobile. And as he left him, Bienville had a lot of ideas of his own. He was just 22 years old, but he decides, well, I'm going to go and explore more. I liked what I saw there in the south of the Mississippi River, the mouth of the Mississippi River. I'm going to go back there and look at these a little more. Now, there's a little bit of political intrigue. Some people didn't like Bienville. Some people didn't like d'Iberville. And so he loses his governorship for a couple of years, but then they reinstate him. And he comes down into the area of the southern part of the Mississippi River, and he says that would make a much better capital for the Louisiana Territory than the capital at Biloxi or Mobile. So he changes the capital to that area. And so really he is called the founder of New Orleans. But all these people who were the explorers were fur traders. they were called coureur de bois, means runner of the woods. And as a young Canadian growing up, I always thought I would love to be a coureur de bois, a runner of the woods. And they competed against the Hudson's Bay Company, but furs were the big thing, furs and hides. And so that's really what they were looking for. In fact, when d'Iberville went back, or was on his way back to France and back to Canada after his first voyage, he brought a bunch of furs and hides back and sold them in New York to finance his trip, actually. So that's what they were looking for. That meant, because as you know, there's probably not as nice a crop of furs and hides in this area as there was up in Canada, that their expertise being in the wrong area, their settlements were really quite a failure. Part of it was lack of women. And so they even sent the cassette women over. These were women from prison. But I don't know if I really would like a prisoner for a woman for a wife or not, but you know, guys feel like they're a prisoner anyway, so. No, I didn't say that. Anyway, here you have a good picture of some of this area from Quebec down to the coast here in New Orleans. This is what was the French territory. This in the north was the British territory. This over here, the 13 colonies, British territory. This area here in Florida, and including Pensacola, that was all Spanish. And this area over here was Spanish as well. So the French were sort of enclosed in this one area. But Louisiana was a big territory with a lot of people where a lot of people could come, but they didn't really come. The next slide, please. I think we went backwards.
That was the next one.
Oh, is that next one? Okay, go to the next one then. And the next one again. Okay, this is, again, a plate showing how LaSalle had come down into Louisiana, and also how d'Iberville had come down, and they claimed it for France. Next slide then. Okay, so that leads us to how then these areas in the south really came to be settled. The Cajuns, where did they all come from? To understand this, we have to go back to the 1600s and the rivalry of Europeans. England, France, Spain, and Portugal. Spain and Portugal became rich off their trading and their areas to the south. There was a lot of gold in that area. They took it back and they became wealthy. Louis the IV saw that the settlements of the New World would improve the interests of France. The problem was that in Canada there's a harsh climate, and he did not have the finances to invest in all this. And thus he encouraged a private colonization. He gives charters to different people. In 1604, there was an expedition from France to Acadia. Acadia is the area, if you're used to looking at the map and see Maine, in the north part of Maine, there north of Maine and to the east is Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Those two areas along the Gaspé Peninsula, that's the bordering on the St. Lawrence River, that area is the Acadia. Okay, that's Acadia. And a lot of the French peasants from certain areas in France came over and they began to settle there in that area. Port Royal was established and reoccupied in 1610. Henry was assassinated in 1612. With that event, Cardinal Richelieu took control of French navigation and ended all kinds of religious freedom. In other words, everybody coming to the new country now had to be Roman Catholic. The British were Protestants, the French were Roman Catholic. That just added to the rivalry they had between each other. English victories gave them control over certain areas of New France. And in 1632, when New France was restored to the French, they kept that area until Queen Anne's War, when in 1710 Acadia was captured by the British. And the Treaty of Utrecht then gave much of the maritime mainland to Britain. That meant the French farmers who lived in that area were British subjects. Even the promise that they could keep their religion, their Roman Catholic religion, meant the French farmers were going to have problems. The French had established Fort Louisbourg, and it had great influence on these Acadian farmers. It was a continuing symbol of French power. The British captured it in 1745, but they returned it with a treaty 3 years later. In 1755, those Acadian farmers began to be seen as a threat. When the 7 Years' War, or the French-Indian Wars, broke out, they still gave their allegiance to France, and so they could be a problem. And thus, 13,000 settlers from that area in Acadia had to go. Not all of them came to Louisiana, but the British exported them from Acadia. Some of them ran off into the bush and hid out because they didn't want to leave. Nobody really wants to leave Canada, unless they have to, or marry a wife from the States or something. Anyway, many of them ended up in Louisiana, where the southern drawl changed Acadian into Cajun. Right. The influence, along with the English and Spanish, also affected the language and the development of the Cajun accent. Much of what, next slide, much of the influence that we see in the South was because the Acadians lived in the South as basically they lived in Acadia in Canada. For one thing, they were farmers. And remember what I had told you was a problem beforehand, why they couldn't settle the South? They didn't cultivate the soil. They didn't cultivate the land. These were now farmers who came down there. And so food follows the old peasant traditions of living off the land. And we find that in Canada, in Acadia, they were settled on areas just like they settled in the Louisiana territories. They had a place on the river and a long piece of territory stretching back. Now, we all used to little squares, right? An acre here, an acre there, or a house here and a house there. Well, that's not the way the Acadians did it. That's not the way the Canadians did it. They had a piece on the river and a long piece of property going back. So they lived off the land, but they had sea. They had the sea there. First time I ever ate lobster was in Quebec, because that's what they lived off. Things lived off the land, fished. They got lobster. They did exactly the same thing when they came down to the South. They got shrimp. They got crab. They did exactly the same thing, and they cultivated the land. Next slide. And so the bayous provided them with the climate they really needed for settling. And I wouldn't say they thrived, but they did well in this area. And so the bayous provided them the kind of environment that they were used to, and they were able to therefore settle that area and have large families. And if you know any Cajun fellows or women, you know that they wore out their wives with 12 and 13 kids, unfortunately for them. But that meant to a large population growth and a big growth for Louisiana. Next slide then. Of course, that's one of the things that they lived off, and anybody who does any Cajun cooking, you know that okra, celery, green peppers, and shrimp are basics to any Cajun food, right? Anybody cook Cajun around here? Nobody? Oh, that's scary. Well, anyway, seafood was a staple, and it was logical that the lobster, cod, and salmon from Canada were going to be replaced by the oysters, crab, alligator, shrimp, crawfish, and catfish, and redfish that were down here. These settlers were of peasant stock in France. They kept their peasant customs, and their recipes probably evolved a little bit, but basically vegetables became green peppers, celery, and rice. Onions and mushrooms were always part of their diet. To these spices they added black pepper and cayenne. How do you say it? Cayenne. That's all right. And we have the basis for Southern cooking. Now another thing, next slide. Another thing that we have as a tradition is the music of the Cajun. So we're going to learn a little Cajun French song, but get your spoons out now. I told you keep your spoons. And this is a tradition, and if you don't mind your neighbor, you can get 2 spoons, because that's actually the best way to play the spoons. But they kept time. Or you can tap them on your table if you want. Here's a clean one. So we're going to sing a little song. I've translated some of it here for you. This word spelt wrong, but that's okay. It's written so that you can sing it, or at least you can read it. Okay, it goes, I love you, vous m'entendez guère. I love you, vous m'entendez pas. It means I love you, but you don't listen, basically. And the French sang this against the British influence, okay, and those who had power and might over them, the peasant stock. So it goes, I love you, and you can use your spoons now. I love you, vous m'entendez guère. I love you, vous m'entendez pas. I love you, vous m'entendez guère. I love you, vous m'entendez pas. I went to the market, mon petit panier sur mon bras. I went to the market, mon petit panier sur mon bras. The first girl I met was a feeding avocado. I love you, vous m'entendez guère. I love you, vous m'entendez pas. I love you, vous m'entendez guère. I love you, vous m'entendez pas. The first girl I met was a feeding avocado. The first girl I met was a feeding avocado. Monsieur, what have you got in petit panier là? What have you got in your basket? I love you, vous m'entendez guère. I love you, vous m'entendez pas. I love you, vous m'entendez guère. I love you, vous m'entendez pas. I got some apples, now achèterai là. I got some apples, now achèterai là. Well, I gave her some apples. Whoops, I messed the verse. Give me some apples and my dad will pay. I love you, vous m'entendez guère. I love you, vous m'entendez pas. I love you, vous m'entendez pas. I love you, vous m'entendez pas. Well, give me some apples, et bonhomme paye ça. Give me some apples, et bonhomme paye ça. So I gave her some apples, mais bonhomme ne paye pas. I love you. Vous m'entendez, guerra? I love you. Vous m'entendez pas? I love you. Vous m'entendez, guerra? I love you. Vous m'entendez pas? I gave her some apples. Mais bonhomme ne paye pas. I gave her some apples. Mais bonhomme ne paye pas. And that is the business with a fille d'un avocat, the daughter of a lawyer. I love you. Vous m'entendez, guerra? I love you. Vous m'entendez pas? I love you. Vous m'entendez, guerra? I love you. Vous m'entendez pas? So that's some of the influence of the Canadians on the south part of the United States. Any questions?
Well, who was, which, for St. Louis, which Louis was he?
St. Louis?
Yeah.
That was one of the earlier kings from France who was a benevolent king. And so he was sainted.
The ninth? No,
It was Louis the Ninth.
Louis IX. Well, thank you for filling in.
The bay is named after.
Yep.
He was killed in the Crusades.
Oh, that's what it was, right. He was killed in the Crusades. Yes, sir.
I saw Mississippi spelled 3 different ways.
Well, that's probably
When
just
did
my
the-
typing.
No, this was ancient.
Oh.
When did the state decide how it should be spelled?
Now, that's a good question. I have to ask Eddie that one. Eddie's got puzzled look on his face, too.
The first slide had
That's the way it's been spelled.
no
I didn't
double
know
letters,
if they were spelled
M-I-S-I-P-I. And the second one, they doubled the S's but not the P's.
Well, it may have been a Cajun spelling, too.
Has to go along with the song. Spell Mississippi with the capital M, I, crooked letter I, humpback, oh, left and S's. Anyway, it's the song.
That's how we
Yes.
learned it.
That's how you learn how to.
I thought I learned M-I-S-S-I-P-I. No? Yes, sir, Jim. Sorry, I can't hear Jim. If you all be quiet for a while.
When we were in Quebec, we were told that the Quebec French, they could understand Cajuns far better than they could understand French from Frenchmen.
And that's true.
It was an old,
Interesting.
it was an old French.
Yeah.
And modern French speaks a different language.
The Cajuns came from Acadia, and so they brought their local language with them down to the south with them. Yeah. So it's very true that Cajun French the Cajun French is much better understood by the Canadian French. When I was in France, I spoke a little bit of French to somebody. I said, "Oh, you're from Quebec, huh?" Because they recognized I had a different kind of accent. Of course, some people just said, well, I couldn't speak French anyway because I had too much English accent in it. Yes, sir. I think somebody had your hand up over here first. No? Go ahead, Patrick.
Well, do Canadians get annoyed with Americans when we say Quebec instead of Quebec?
No, Canadians don't get annoyed about anything, especially if Trump says, we're going to annex Canada.
You're right.
No, they really, Canadians sometimes say Quebec as well as Quebec. Because it's spelled Q-U.
Yeah.
Other questions? Oh, yes, ma'am.
How did the Cajuns come down from Acadiana?
The British and both the British brought them down, and the French ships brought them down. So it was
How did they get up there in the first place?
to Canada.
No, well, yeah, to Canada.
They came from France across to New France just by ship from France. Yeah,
And when they came down to Louisiana, they didn't come down to Mississippi, they came down around.
They came around,
north,
yeah.
All that.
yeah,
The Atlantic and then through the Gulf.
yeah. Yeah, if you know the trade winds, and you look at the weather, you can see that a lot of our weather comes, especially the hurricanes, come across from northern part of Africa. The prevailing winds across the middle part of the United States go across the other direction. And so you have a way that they could sail using the winds coming south and come around, and then it was easy to send the once they got down to the south by Florida, it was easy to come across to the Louisiana territory. Well, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Jim.
Just to add a little bit to that, I went to school in Lafayette University of Louisiana, it's called now. And back in the 60s, when they would do the television commercials, they would do them in English and then they would do them in French. But then this is in the 60s. And of course that language stopped in the 1600s. So they would be advertising a car and they would talk about the carriage with automatic transition. So they would take the terms and add a French accent to the terms. So it was very interesting. And of course, you had, I'd go visit on the farm with one of my buddies, Warren Perrin, who spoke here, and his grandparents talked no English. So I'd be there with his mom and dad and his grandparents, and we'd talk, and then they'd talk to the grandparents so they could understand what we were